Hi everybody, Mike from the Digital Media Lab. We're going to cover part 2, adjustment layers. We're going to start by going to Open inside of Photoshop, and we want to open our image. Come on, open. You want to select youngstars.jpg and select Open. We're going to begin with the solid fill adjustment layers. I'm going to go up to Layer and select New Fill Layer and select Solid Color. Click OK. It doesn't really matter what color you select here, as long as you select a fairly saturated color. I'll pick a nice blue. There we go. And then we can see here that our color fill layer is on top of our background layer. Now the reason why that we're seeing blue is because it fills the entire area. There's not much difference between this and having a layer here and simply going to Edit, Fill, and filling this layer with the same color. There's not much difference here, except that the color fill layer, I'll go ahead and delete that. Our color fill layer actually gives us a little bit more flexibility with how we use it. So color fill layers are preferred because if I want to change the color, I simply double click the thumbnail right here and I can adjust the color to anything that I wish. I'll go ahead and click cancel because I'm happy with my blue. With my adjustment layers, just like any layer, I can change my blend modes. And again, your go-to blend modes are multiply, screen, overlay, soft light, and these 4 blend modes at the bottom here are pretty useful. Go ahead and pick the one that you like. I think overlay is going to work pretty well for me right here. And then we'll go ahead and move on to the next blend mode. I'll go ahead and make sure that my color fill layer is selected. Whenever you create a new adjustment layer of any type, it will always put it above the selected layer. So I'm going to make sure that my top layer is the most selected layer. Again, I'll go up to Layer, New Fill Layer, and I'm going to select Gradient. Again, it will let me have some options here. I'm going to select OK. All right, and then we can bring up some of the gradient options. Now inside of here we have our standard options here where we can select things like a radial gradient and different kinds of types of gradients. I'm going to set it to actually radial. We could adjust the scale and things like that. If you click this drop down menu, you can actually select some of the default gradients. Now by the default, one of the gradients that it usually picks by default is this one right here, which is going to set from your foreground color to your background. So right now, if I select this gradient, you'll notice that my foreground color is this light blue and my background color is white. So it's going to go from blue to white in this case. You can also set it to foreground to transparent. Okay, so it's starting with your foreground color. It's not using my background color here, and it's going to transparent. And then it has a basic black and white gradient, so on and so forth. There's a couple of in here. If you click this little wrench icon, you can access some of these other libraries. I'm going to go ahead and select Spectrum and select OK. And I want to go ahead and select the first gradient that appeared in my spectrum. It's called Spectrum. It should be on your list right here. There we go. Now one of the things that you can do is, let's see, I'll go ahead and click OK. And we need to adjust our blend modes. In this case, a blend mode of soft light works pretty well. It's going to be kind of a subtle effect for now. Now one of the things is I'd like my gradient to kind of start from over here, but it's kind of starting from the center of the document. I can adjust the position of the gradient by double-clicking the thumbnail for the gradient fill. And then with this window active, I can actually click inside the canvas and adjust the position of the gradient. We also need to scale this up quite a bit, so I'm going to scale this up. There we go. Now I get a nice rainbow kind of gradient kind of going across here. All right, we're going to go into our next adjustment layer. This time I'm going to create the adjustment layer in a little bit different way. I'm going to go to the bottom of my layers palette, and if I select this little circle icon at the bottom of my layers palette, I can actually access all of my adjustment layers right inside of the layers palette itself. Pretty convenient way of doing it. I kind of prefer this way, honestly. These first 3 are the fill adjustment layers that we've been working on so far. So I'm going to select pattern. Now by default it will come up with some random pattern. I'm not really sure what I have here. That's okay. And just as with the gradient before it, I can click this little fly down list and I can select some of my here. Now I've adjusted my library here and I want you guys to go ahead and do the same. By clicking this little wrench icon, it's not a wrench, it's a gear, this little gear icon, I can access Photoshop's different libraries for patterns that they have for you. You can actually create your own pattern, but for now, let's just go ahead and use the default patterns. I want you guys to go ahead and select Web Patterns. It's going to ask you if you want to append. Now, I don't want to append this because it's just going to add it to the end of my list. I actually want it to completely replace the patterns with the new patterns. And I'm going to click OK. And everyone should see the same patterns as I have here. Go ahead and experiment and try different patterns. I think that this pattern works pretty well here at the top left as long as it's scaled up a bit. So I'll go ahead and scale that up a bit. I think these nice horizontal lines are going to work pretty well. I'll go ahead and click OK. And as with before, I want to go ahead and change the blend mode to overlay. And that gives us a nice kind of cross-hatch pattern like that. All right, so we've kind of done some fill adjustment layers. Let's go ahead and change to some other kinds of adjustment layers, but let's get organized here. I'm going to go ahead and shift-click all three of my fill adjustment layers here. And I'm going to, at the bottom of my layers palette, I'm going to hit this little folder icon, which will group them together. You could also hit the hotkey of Control-G. So I'll rename it. Let's call this fill. And I'll go ahead and hide that for now. The next thing we're going to look at is regular adjustment layers. We're going to start by going to the bottom of the layers palette and selecting brightness and contrast. We're going to go down some of these in order. All right, brightness and contrast is pretty basic. If you increase the brightness, it'll increase the brightness of the image. If you increase the contrast, it'll increase the contrast of the image. When you increase contrast, you're actually increasing the brightness of the image and you're increasing the darkness of the image for areas that are darker. So the brighter parts will get brighter and the darker parts will get darker. But of course, I think you guys can see that. I'm going to go ahead and set my brightness somewhere around in the mid-50s. That's going to be fine. And my contrast a little bit higher, maybe about 60. Now, one of the things that tends to happen with this is brightness and contrast can sometimes change the colors of my image. If I kind of show and hide this, you'll notice that not only does the image get brighter, but it also gets a little bit more saturated as well. We can prevent that from happening by changing our blend mode from normal to luminosity. We can see here that if I kind of go back and forth, you'll see here that the image gets a lot less saturated. And that way we're only affecting the values that we want. You don't have to do this with every image, but in this case it works pretty well. The next kind of adjustment layer that we're going to look at is vibrance and saturation. Again, a fairly basic one. So I'm going to go down to the bottom on my layer palette. I'm going to select vibrance. That'll create a new vibrance layer inside of my properties panel. By the way, if for any reason you don't see this properties panel, you can simply go to Windows Properties. And this way I have stricter control over my vibrance and saturation. And I'll go ahead and increase those to taste. Now the difference between vibrance and saturation is that vibrance will do saturation but in a much more controlled manner. Saturation, if we can see here, if I really crank up my saturation, it really tends to like hypersaturate, whereas vibrance will do it in a little bit more controlled manner. It won't, even at its maximum value, it won't oversaturate things too much. So I'll go ahead and set a pretty high vibrance value, but sometimes you kind of want a little bit of both. You have to experiment and see what works to taste. The last adjustment layer that I want to cover today is if I go to here and I select Hue Saturation, we get our Hue Saturation dialog box. Now, Hue Saturation has a lot to it. Some of these techniques are for editing imagery itself, not so much for kind of creating designs like you'll be doing in your project. So I'm just going to kind of cover the part of it that you'll be using in this class. And the main part of it is that you're going to be adjusting the hue. So if we adjust the hue back and forth, what we can do is we notice that we can change the color of the image. We can really kind of adjust this color and have fun with it and get it like that. Go ahead and adjust it to your taste. Again, we have the same saturation slider that we had before. It's the exact same. There's no difference. You also have a lightness slider here. I don't recommend you really using this too much, as brightness and contrast tend to work much better in terms of what you want. This lightness slider tends to just be a little bit, I don't know, heavy-handed, let's say. So I would tend to avoid it unless you have some specific use for it. Okay, and then just as before, we're going to cover our adjustment layers, and we're going to group them together. I'll go ahead and hit Control-G this time, and we'll call these adjustments. Now just a quick note that there are several other kinds of adjustment layers in here. But for the purposes of this class, they're not very useful. For example, levels and curves are highly useful when working with photography and getting the exposure 100% correct. But we don't need to do that in this class, as you guys will be using stock imagery. So there you go. All right, in part 3, we'll look at making some final adjustments to this as well as adjusting some of these masks.